Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay there. We had a few issues setting up the smart stage today. So, welcome everyone. I hope that you're doing well. We're now in week 8 of term. Hasn't that gone quickly? And today's topic, and the topic of the workshops for this week, is communication, but to different audiences. So we're going to differentiate between the needs of different types of audience. So let me just see, my clicker's not working. Do you want me to give it back to you? Bear with, guys. I did switch it on. Won't be a minute. Just some technical hitches. Nope, still not working. You're going to do it for me. Okay, right. Can you click all of these? And the next one, just put the whole screen up. Keep going. Yep. You could just, that's it. And the next one, and the next one. And that's it. Okay, stop. No, back one. Back one. That's it, there. So we're going to be looking at 4 things this morning. First of all, we'll just start by talking generally about telling stories with data and analytics, thinking about how you might plan your communication and the different types of communication that you might need to make. And then we're going to dive in a bit deeper and think about, well, who are the different audiences? And I'll differentiate between 2 types of audiences, and then think about how do we plan and think about what we need to plan for when we're looking at different audiences. So, got a couple of quotes to start off with. And this is a quote from a practitioner from Harvard Business School. Always remember that applying analytical techniques to managerial problems requires both art and science. I love that bit. And then he says, over my career, I've learned that it's the soft skills that are the hardest to master, but they're critically important. And by now, given that we're in week 8, I hope you're getting a good appreciation of the different sorts of soft skills that we're covering on this course, to give you that feel that analytics isn't just the sciencey bit. It's not just about the coding and the hard sums, but it's actually also about those soft bits, about how you think about your problems, you think about your stakeholders, how you decide on the matching between problems and techniques, planning your projects, thinking about risk, thinking about ethics. All of those really fall under the banner of the soft skills. Next slide, please. So another quote here. Data storytelling can help turn data insights into action. Without effective communication, insights can go unnoticed or unremembered by your audience. Both hard and soft skills are crucial for leveraging data to its fullest potential. So this is another one saying that you need different skill sets as analytics professionals. And this one talks about effective communication. So that's really what this week is all about, is how can you think about effective communication, but in the context of different audiences. Next slide, please. So this is a really ancient example of how you can tell stories using graphical purposes. And this is an excellent slide. Does anyone know what this is? Some of you might have looked. There's a link below in the notes of the slide that gives you the source of this. But do any of you know what this is? It's quite a famous visualization. I'll give you some clues. You can tell by the nature of the writing. Yes, you're right. It is a map of some kind. and it is a map from the 19th century, okay? Long before we had computers, analytics, formal analytics, AI or anything like that. This is a map that depicts the story or the story over time. So it's a dynamic depiction of a campaign, of somebody's campaign. And on the left-hand side, you can see the thick, over here, you can see the thick beige area. This is the start of the campaign and the size of the army. And over time, you can see, as we move across the slide, that that beige bit gets smaller. That's the outstrip, okay? And the black one coming back, still size of the army, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm not going to tell you too much because I want you to go and have a look at it. Follow the link that's underneath the slide in the notes and just have a little look at that, because it is really effective graphic that tells you the story of this disastrous campaign, disastrous from the point of view, particularly in terms of the number of fighting soldiers' lives lost. Next slide, please. So what sort of stories can we tell with analytics? This is taken from Davenport and just gives you a classification of the different types of stories that you can tell. If you're interested in talking about time, you can talk about the past, you can talk about the present, you can talk about the future, the obvious 3 different time zones there. And over in the right-hand column there, you can see the purposeful nature of the stories that you might want to tell in respect to time. If we go down to the next row and look at focus, again, you can see some questions that such stories can help you answer. What happened? Why did it happen? What caused things to happen? Etc. And then he gives 2 other categories, depth and method. So CSI was an American drama, I guess you'd call it, very famous drama about 2 characters that used to go off and investigate extraterrestrial happenings, I guess you'd call them. So the idea of the sort of the CSI is this drilling down into depth, not necessarily looking for the evidence of aliens with analytics, but actually saying these are small ad hoc, one-off things that you might want to dive deep down into and explore. So lots of different types of stories that you can tell using data and analytics. And as ever, if we make links back to the previous weeks, when you are starting your analytics project and you're getting through it, all of along the way, you're going to be talking about your project to various different stakeholders. And you need to be thinking about, what is it that I want to be talking about when I'm talking to these different people? Am I telling a story about time? Am I trying to talk about something in depth? So you need to have a purposeful reasoning to your communications with people. Next one, please. Now, I've included this slide. It's quite an old paper, but I really like this because it's the idea. Klein gives this idea that when you're telling stories about analytics projects, it's not just the output that matters. It's not just the analysis that matters, but which he calls the content story, but actually it's the story of the intervention. This word intervention means project, the analytics project. So what is the story of the intervention? Okay. How does it fit within the bigger framework? What was the process that you went through? Yeah, the story of the content, he says, is a subplot to a much bigger picture story. So it's worth bearing in mind when we're thinking about the communications and the stories that we want to tell with data. It can be very easy simply to focus on the analysis bit, but actually that analysis bit sits within the wider project and within a wider story about that project. Next slide, please. Oh, you have to click through all 4 again. Thank you. So we're going to move on now to think about how you plan your communication. And I think this really captures it well. I'll just give you a little moment to absorb the humour here. Can you see that there is actually a patient? That's why we lived on 3. Not after 3, not just before 3, but on 3. So communication is uber important. Next slide, please. So what is communication? It's the means by which information or instructions are exchanged. Next bit, please. Keep going. And one more. One more. There we go. The important bit here for me is that the message that is received by your audience, is that what you intended? The idea of good or successful communication is when the person listening understands what it was you intended them to understand. Okay, and that isn't always the case, is it? Sometimes you think you're being really clear, and maybe your audience is being very polite and sort of nodding, but do you know that they've really understood what you wanted them to understand? Something for you to think about. Next slide, please. So when we think about the stories and the different types of communication that we might make, what can we use? Well, as this slide here shows, there is a huge variety of different forms of communicating with your stakeholders. And as the next slide shows, you can put these into a plan. You could have a comms plan, a communications plan for how you communicate with different stakeholders. And I think this is great for your planning in your project. It's important that one of the activities you include in your planning stages is how you're going to communicate and with whom and when. But one of the things that I don't think this slide does capture is what's the nature of the audience? Okay, therefore, what is it? What is the way that I want to communicate? For example, if I'm going to be sending an email, what type of language should I use? If I'm going to be going into a meeting, then what sort of support do I need? You know, if I'm going to take along some slides, then how can I design slides that are effective given that who might be in the audience? And next slide, please. So how can we think about planning any communications that we might undertake? So this little table here gives you some prompts to help you think about some of these issues. So firstly, and most importantly, who's in the audience and what do they expect of you? How much detail do you need to include for that particular audience? And what's the best way to get that communication across? Is it a presentation? Is it some form of written report? Is it simply a chat and a conversation? Okay. What's the bigger picture? How does it all fit into this bigger picture? And what do you want to achieve? What do you want to get out of this? And how will you know when you've achieved that? Thinking through those sorts of issues can then help you form a communications plan. So we've talked about different stakeholders, and we've hinted, or I've hinted at the idea that different stakeholders might have different needs. So let's go and look at that now and think about 2 types of audiences and the different needs that they might have. Next slide. I think you're going to have to click through all of them again and go on. So who are the 2 classic audiences, or well, who are the different audiences rather, that you might have to communicate with about your project? The client is the obvious one. Okay, click again, please. Who's got to implement the recommendations that come out of the work that you do? If you're running a system, who's going to be using the system that you've developed? Next one, please. There might be wider stakeholders involved in the project that you want to communicate with. And the last one. There also might be fellow analysts. So in your team or in the wider analytics community, either within your organisation or outside, you might want to be talking to them about the work that you've done. So we've got different audiences. Next click, please. And you'll have to click through again. Thank you. So each of these audiences has different backgrounds, and they're going to have different levels of technical knowledge. So they're not all going to be as expert as you in analytics. And that's a really important thing that you need to take account of when you're thinking about who you are going to communicate with. So can we have the next slide, please? So let's now think about your skills, your communication skills, be they oral skills or be they written skills. And Persaud here gives you a list of some of the skills that you need as analytics professionals. Okay, the first one is perhaps obvious to you. You've got to be able to explain what you've done. That could be very complex analysis in a very clear and actionable manner for your audience. You need the ability to be able to communicate with different types of audiences, be they technical audiences or non-technical audiences. Okay, you've got to be able to communicate the value of capabilities and technologies. Also, you've got to be able to clearly present your analyses. You might want to be using visualization tools, for example, to help guide decisions. Well, they need to be appropriately thought through in terms of the audiences, be they technical or non-technical. You've got to be able to tell stories with your data, okay? Data-driven stories, such as that graphic of the campaign, the Russia campaign that I showed you earlier on, which means that you need to have good storytelling as well as presentation skills. Next slide, please. So I think it's helpful to think about two classic audiences. That is you, the modeler, versus the client or the manager. Okay. And if you think about the different roles, you, the modeler, has to understand the reality of the problem situation you've been asked to investigate, explore, develop a system for, and you create some form of model that produces some analysis and some results. The manager, on the other hand, is the flip of that. They have to take your outputs and implement them back into the reality. So you've got these two different roles here working slightly differently in relationship to the reality and the model or any analytics work that you've developed. Next slide, please. So let's now think about those two separate audiences. What is it that you need as an analytics person? Okay, obviously you need to be good at the hard sums. You need the numeracy because of the nature of the analytics toolkit that you're going to draw on. You're going to need knowledge and experiences of the types of model likely to fit the particular situation faced. Okay, we looked at that, I think it was week 4, when we talked about how do you match the analytics framing and analytics techniques to the problem framing. By and large, you're taking a scientific perspective, okay, with respect to the accuracy and the validity of data. So those are two quite core concepts that you're concerned about with the work that you do. How accurate and how valid is the analytics that you're undertaking, and you'll often do some validation of the work that you're doing. You want to make sure that your algorithms are doing what you expect them to do. You want to make sure that the data is appropriate for the nature of the analysis that you want to do, etc. And you will have an explicit methodology, a process. So we've in the MSBA program, we've taught you all about the CRISP DM methodology. So, you'll be going through the stages of that. Let's now contrast those characteristics with those of the manager. Okay. The manager may have an analytics background, they may not, but they will need that contextual awareness of the political and managerial complexity of the problem situation and the real world situation, how it fits within their organizational setting. They're going to need skills in managing the people, behavioral sensitivity in managing people, because people are always involved, aren't they? Even if you are systematizing something, at some point, people are going to be interacting. They may well need the project management skills in controlling the project and its implementation. They will need awareness of what's gone into the model, any assumptions that you're making. And they're the ones that are going to have to implement the results of the analysis. So they need to have that ability to be decisive, in other words, to take decisions. So we've got these two audiences. Let's now think about, if we were planning a presentation to these different types of audiences, what might their needs be? Let me just check where we are on time. Right, we're good timing. So click through all four. So we're going to talk about now communicating. Go back to the technical, thank you. So technical audiences, who might these be? These might be your fellow analysts or people that have that technical background that you bring to it too. So what are these audiences going to need? They are going to need to understand the context, the objectives. In other words, why is this project, why is these analyses, why are they taking place? They want to understand what framing you've chosen to frame the problem, to structure the problem. They'll need to understand your choice of analytics approach. They'll want to be convinced, won't they, that you've done the appropriate matching, that here's your problem situation, you've matched it with an analytics technique, and that's appropriate. Why? Because they have a technical background, they will understand the nature of the relationship that goes on when those sorts of choices are made. They will want to know that you've done decent analytics, yeah, the technically sound bit. They'll want to be reassured that what you've done is technically sound. So you might want to be thinking about, you need to convince them of not only of the formulation of how you've gone about deploying your analytics, but also how you've gone about checking that deployment of your analytics. They'll want to know that you've used appropriate data and what you've done with that data. Have you cleaned it? Have you done your EDA, your exploratory data analysis? They'll also want to know about the assumptions, but their interest is perhaps more from the technical point of view. If you're doing some statistical modeling, they might want to know, have you made any assumptions about normality, for example? And you can use these technical terms because these are technical audiences. They'll understand the nuances of what normality means, because normality, when you're talking to a technical audience, is all about the statistical assumptions and properties, isn't it? It's not about normality as in normal everyday life. It has a very specific technical meaning. They'll want to know that you've done your validation and verification. Yeah. Verification is a very interesting one, because in presentations, even to technical audiences, do you really say, honestly, I debugged my code and I checked it? Probably not, because I think even with technical audiences, they take that for granted, that you're not going to get up there and present stuff that you haven't checked, because that's just poor practice, isn't it? But they might want to know, how have you gone about validating? How have you gone about checking your outputs versus your inputs? How do you know that these outputs are sufficiently accurate for the purpose at hand? And of course, they'll want to understand the results of the analysis too. But because you're talking to technical audiences, you might be able to introduce some of your technical terms here. Let's now contrast this with the needs of non-technical audiences. Next slide, please. So this might be your client, for example, or it might be other stakeholders who've been invited along to presentations, or with whom you might want to be talking about the problem situation because you want to understand and get information from them. So these people do not necessarily have the same background as you. They won't have maths degrees, computer science degrees, what have you. Some of them may be petrified of maths. Some of them may not have done maths since 16, the age of 16, you know, the GCSE equivalent in the UK. And you don't want to put these off. You don't want to bamboozle them. Your job here is not to, you know, come across and say, I'm so wonderful because I can talk to you in loads of technical jargon, and that's going to convince you that I am an effective analyst with my technical jargon. I would argue that's a failed communication with these audiences, because what you want to do with these audiences is you really want to engage them. You know why you're talking to them, because you've thought about the purpose of the conversation, the presentation, etc. So what is it that you're going to want to do with technical audiences? What is it that their needs might be? They're going to want to understand the problem situation, the objectives. They're going to understand the value that all of this has for them, right? What is it that this analytics, this modeling, you know, this coding, what is it that it can offer them? They might need to understand the fundamental assumptions behind any analyses you've done, and they might be interested in the approach that you've chosen, but they're not going to want to see any, you know, huge numbers of mathematical equations with summation signs or integration signs or anything like that in them. They will want to understand the contextualized results of the analyses. In other words, not simply, you know, the coding has given me this output, but they need to understand the output in relation to the problem that you've set yourself to explore with this analysis. And then finally, they're going to want to understand the implications of that analysis. So I'll just let me pause there for a moment. Just let you take that in. So we've got two types of audiences. That means that when you're planning your communications, it's not just simply a question of going through and saying, okay, what was the purpose? What was the context? You actually need to split your planning for the different types of audiences that you might be planning your communications for. And in this session, we're going to talk about just the two, the technical and the non-technical. So the next 3 slides break that planning down into more detail. So first of all, I've taken these 3 slides from Grossman et al. So they differentiate between 2 types of communications, 2 types of audiences. They talk about a narrative communication versus a managerial communication. Okay, so narrative is designed for the technical audiences, and the managerial is designed for the non-technical audiences. So when we're thinking about our communications, let's think through the assumptions that we're going to make about our planning. Okay, so let's look at the second column, the narrative column. So this is for technical audiences. This is, imagine that you are talking to your fellow MSBA students or member of staff, for example, or other analysts. Okay, you'll want to give a detailed perspective because your audience has that technical knowledge, your fellow analysts, for example. You might want to share any challenges or personal learning experiences. What about outputs? Well, of course, you're going to want to show them the solution and any related analyses, but you can show them outputs. You can show them technical outputs. You can talk in your technical jargon. Okay. What about the planning assumption regarding the organization? Well, it's the organization is, you assuming the organization is ready and willing and able, but lacks the solution. And your work is giving them the solution. Okay. What's your assumption about who's the responsibility to make the decisions here? You are preparing, you are thinking about the idealized decision maker here. So let's contrast these planning assumptions if you were thinking about presenting to a non-technical audience. And you'll see there that the theme, now go back, I'm still on the previous slide, thank you. The theme here is about the meaning of the analytical work, not the performance of the analytical work. you've got a very different audience. You've got a non-technical audience. That means your perspective is quite high level. Who might this be? This might be to managers or other non-technical stakeholders. Okay, what is the purpose? You want to influence the way they think with your work. As it says here, you want to affect the understanding and thinking of the audience. You might want to influence key people with your analyses. In terms of the analytical outputs, you're not showing them the detail. You're thinking about focusing on the different courses of outcomes that they could take and evaluating them. The assumption that you make from an organizational perspective is the organization is unsure whether and how to act. Maybe they don't think they're ready to act. And so the idea of your presentation to them or your communication to them is to help support that, is to help give them confidence there. And in terms of what's the wider context that all of this sits within, it's about the social and political decision-making process. So you're sitting within that context rather than just thinking that you are aiming your work at an idealized decision maker. So that first slide thinks about the planning assumptions of your communications. Let's go on to the next slide and talk about the analytical aspects of thinking about your presentation. So I'll go down now and I'll contrast the two. So from the narrative point of view, presenting to various fellow analysts, what are you going to be talking about? You're going to be talking about your model and your coding, all the techie stuff. Whereas when you're talking to managers or clients or non-technicals, the focus is on the functionality and the utility of the analysis, what you've done. They don't need to see the detail of the model and the coding. So thinking about what the model does, you might want to give fellow analysts a tour of the model, a little demo of how it works. You might even show them some code. But you wouldn't do that with a non-technical audience, because you'd probably scare the pants off them. And they may well think, oh my God, these are really, really clever people. But actually, that's not the purpose of your presentation to them, your communication. You actually want to engage them so that they use your stuff. So you may well want to explain the model outputs, its inputs, its functionality. You're not going to give them too much we're not going to give them any technical detail about how the model was created. You might give them an overview of what the model does. Whereas with the fellow analysts, you can talk about formulas. You can show them all of your summation signs and your fancy maths. You might want to talk about what challenges you overcome. You might want to talk about any innovations, any technical innovations that you've introduced in your work. Now, in terms of the level of effort, thinking from the point of view of fellow analysts, you may well talk to them about how much time it took you and what difficulties you had. But you might over here instead focus simply on the resources and time. You might give them an overview, but you're not going to be going into the detail about that. So what's the whole purpose of these presentations? When you're talking to fellow analysts, it's the credibility. It's the credibility of the model. I've built a good model for this situation. Honestly, it's a credible model. Whereas actually, when you're presenting to clients or non-technical audiences, it's your credibility that is on show, at stake here. Okay, not the credibility of the model, but your credibility. Do they trust you in what you're doing? And if you're not careful, if you get too techie and what have you, they may think that you are very clever people, but they may not be convinced that you're the right person to help solve their problems and answer their questions. Last slide, please. So, bringing some of that together and thinking about what about the communication elements, when we're thinking of planning our communications. What does the presentation focus on? Talking to fellow analysts, you're talking about complexity, you're talking about model insight. Whereas when you're talking to non-technical audiences, it's all about clarity and the managerial insight. That means you need to use different language. When you're talking to your fellow analysts, you can jump into any jargon you like. But when you're talking with your clients or non-technical audiences, you have to use, it says here, a managerial vocabulary, but I would argue you need to use their vocabulary, whoever they are. If they're managers, if they're clients, but if they're other stakeholders, you need to be talking in their language, not in your language, not in your technical language. Other things to think about. Numerical precision. When you're talking to a technical audience, you can go down into, you can have as many significant figures as you like. But when you're talking, with these higher level presentations, you might want to reduce the number of significant figures that you use and give overview situation, unless the client needs that level of technicality, detail in terms of precision. If you're dealing with a finance manager who understands the numbers, they may want far more precision. What about how do you present your results? Okay. It's all right to show the detail to fellow analysts. You might want to show them the technical output. If you're doing, any statistical output, you might want to show them in your regression all of the detail of your R squareds and your standard errors and all of that, your P values, your T values, whatever. But when you're talking with a managerial audience, you're going to be quite choosy about what you present, and you might not show such dense tables of numbers. You might make more use of visualization. Okay, and down the bottom here it says what sort of visualizations? Simple charts. You might have complex charts. That data, that graphic I showed you of the campaign, there's a lot of information in there, but the way that it was presented was really easy to follow, and it supports the telling of a narrative. If we had the time, I could have talked you through the various different things that graphic showed you, and you would have been able to follow. So it was quite a complex graph, but it was presented in a coherent and quite a simple way. If you're talking to a technical audience, you don't need to worry so much about the simplicity, although it can be useful to include such graphs and charts with them too. But you wouldn't worry if you had to show much more complex charts. So in the next slide, I have a quiz, and I've decided to keep it very, very simple. So I'm going to pose you 2 questions, and I'd like your answers in the chat. Okay. So quiz number 1. Imagine that you are talking to a technical audience. Which of these terms, and I hope that you recognize all of these terms, I've tried to focus on ones that I know you'll have covered in term 1. Which of these terms could you use with a technical audience? I'm just going to wait for a few more of you, see if anyone disagrees. Okay, what we're seeing in the chat is all of them. I would agree, all of them. Okay, I'd have a bit of a caveat there. So if you were talking to a statistician who didn't know optimization, yeah, you could use that term, but you might have to define it for them. Equally, if you were talking to an optimizer who didn't understand the subtleties of R squared, for example, if doing a regression, then again, you wouldn't be afraid to use it, but you might have to explain what the term meant. So I agree that for technical audiences, all of them are possible. Now, what about if we are talking to a non-technical audience? Okay. So again, I'll just wait for a moment. So So most of you are saying mean and standard deviations. I've got one person saying, I've got one person saying R squared, but you'd have to explain it in plain language. I've got other people saying you could use the term shadow price to a non-technical audience, and that a non-technical audience would understand what a shadow price meant. So I think and then I've got one person saying none of them. I think you could assume that people understand the word mean. They might, depending on their background, understand the word average rather than mean, because mean is quite a technical term, isn't it? You've got mean, median, and mode as three measures of centrality of data. So people might be familiar with the term average, and most people would think that as the arithmetic mean. Standard deviation, I think, is a really interesting one. When I was in your shoes, I went for an interview for a job, and I was shown some data on a graph, and I was asked to explain to a non-technical audience what standard deviation meant. And I struggled because I calculated it, and I hadn't got in my head a good simple explanation of how to explain what the concept of standard deviation was in terms of data. I'd just been so used to calculating it, I hadn't really thought about now how would I, explain that to somebody that didn't necessarily understand what that meant. And I think that's one of the interesting things as you go through a lot of the modules that you're going on now. Your initial target for yourself might be, I've got to work out how to calculate it. But I would encourage you to, if that has been your focus, to pause and say, do I actually understand what the concept means? If I had to explain it to my mum or my dad or my friend who's doing liberal arts, would I be able to do that? Nice challenge there. So I hope that's food for thought in terms of thinking about the different types of audience that you might face. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So this is my take on looking at regression. Okay, I am not a regression expert. I understand the basics and I understand linear regression. But you get me into the more complicated regressions, logistic regression, etc., and I would understand sort of at a basic level, but not in the detailed level. So this is my take on what, if I were doing a regression model, what would I think to include with my technical versus my non-technical audiences about my regression modeling. And what you can see is I've got a whole list of technical stuff down here and not much for my non-technical audience. But you'll notice that it's not all about the technicalities on this left-hand side of the slide. There is some framing and formulation there too. So I'd be talking about my data, my sources. I would be talking about how I'd formulated the problem, what I had designated to be my dependent and my independent variables. I'd be showing some scatter plots where relevant to look at the relationships between the dependent and different independent variables to try to convince you that I had built a suitable model. I'd be showing you all of my technical outputs, because when you're building a regression model, there's two aspects, isn't there? Is the model any good? Is it for predicting? And then using the model to do your predicting. So I'd be focusing on that technical aspect of, is my model any good? Does my model represent my data well? And then I might show you some of my outputs, okay? If I'm presenting to a non-technical audience, I'm going to want to say what I've modeled, what my variables are, and I'll talk about what data's in there. I'll show them some plots. I'll show them the regression equation to explain the nature of the relationship between the variables that I've managed. And I would explain that in plain English. I might show them some examples of if our independent variables take these values, then this is what the dependent variable would take. But obviously I wouldn't use those technical terms. I talk in the language of whatever I'd called the variables. Now, one of the things I think it's really interesting is I think that you are well versed on this side. What happens is when you're challenged with presenting to a non-technical audience, I think that's where you start to you pause because you're not quite too sure, or you try to get through all of this technical detail, but in plain English, and that's the wrong approach. Because what you got to remember is if we went back to those previous slides, those previous 3 detailed planning slides for the two different audiences, the point is that there are different expectations from these 2 different audiences. The non-technical audience isn't expecting to see any of this even explained nice and clearly. They're really focusing on the usability and the functionality, so the usability of the models and the analyses to help support whatever situation they've asked for support with. So let me just pause there. I'm just trying to see what the time is. Oh, we've got loads of time. I just want to pause there and see if there are any questions or reflections that you want to raise at this point. Okay, nothing's coming through. So what I'd like to just finish with is to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do in the workshops this week. So I've got a optimization case, a very simple linear programming case. And I have asked CMAC to write the code for me. Whenever I've done optimization, either as a practitioner or even as a teacher, I've either used specialist linear programming software, or I've used Microsoft Excel. So I can model it in Excel, but I know that he's taught you through Python. So I've asked him to produce the Python code and the output that comes from that Python code. Now that file is a Word file that gives you the whole case study. It gives you the brief, it gives you the LP formulation, it gives you the code to produce the solution, and it gives you the output. What I ask you to do is to give that a quick read before your workshop. So I appreciate that 2 groups have got their workshop today, the other 2 groups have got their workshop tomorrow. It's not a difficult case, it's quite a simple LP example. And what we're going to be doing in the workshops is thinking about how do we present that case to different types of audience. So could I have the next slide, please? You just scroll through. So these are the things that we've looked at today. We've looked at some of the ideas around telling stories with data and analytics, thinking about how you plan your communication, thinking about who the different audiences might be. And we focused on technical versus non-technical audiences, and then thinking through the detail about how you plan and think about your communications with those 2 different types of audience. Next slide, please. So if this is a topic that you find quite interesting and want to take forward for your assessment, here are some links for you to follow of what I've used today to put these slides together. And the final slide, please. And we'll end with the week's quiz. So please remember to do the quiz. I think last week we had approximately 80% participation. So there's a few of you that had either forgotten to do the quiz or, well, yeah, had forgotten to do it, basically. So please do that quiz, and we will see you later on today or tomorrow. Now, I think there is a question there. Let me just see from Arthur. When communicating with a non-technical audience, how should we simplify the terms we use or identify terms they might not understand? That is, I think, well, first of all, that's an excellent question. Thank you for posing that question. And that is precisely what we're going to be looking at in the workshop. So Arthur, I'd say to you, hold on to that thought in the workshops, because we're going to put together technical versus non-technical presentations. And that is precisely the thing that those of you doing the non-technical audiences are going to have to grapple with. Okay. So I won't answer that question myself, because I think it will be better experienced during the workshop, and then you'll see the technical and the non-technical presentations side by side, and that is something that we can then discuss in the workshops. And another question from Myra: when talking to technical client, how to explain everything nicely? Yeah, I think that's another one. That's another excellent question that is really for the workshop. I think it helps for you to have a go. Yeah, and it's really good that you're thinking of these questions now. And I'd say, hold on to it. Hold on to these questions and bring them along to the workshop and pose them in the reflections. It may be that when you see a technical and a non-technical presentation side by side, that these questions get answered. But if not, these are certainly topics that we can pick up in the discussion when we reflect about the different nature of the presentations. I think one of the things I would say, Myra, to answer your question, you know, how do you not give everything away? It's how you structure the presentation, you know, because when you're talking about, in the early stages of a presentation, you might be talking about the problem context, the problem formulation. You haven't told them any answers then. You know, you're building up, you're technically building up the story as you go. You know, your first slide isn't necessarily to a technical audience going to be, here's my answer. It's going to be, this is what I thought the problem was, this is why I chose the modeling approach that I chose, or the coding approach I've chose. You then might talk about the assumptions that underlie it. So you're sort of chipping away at the story. You're not giving everything away up front. You're building the story up. And it's the same when you're talking to a non-technical audience. You're just building up a different story. It hasn't got a technical emphasis. But you're not going to start the very first slide necessarily with, my recommendation is this. You might want to show them how you've arrived at that recommendation, but without going into the technical detail. If there are no other questions, then please, I can see people are already starting to leave the room. So do feel free to go now. If you do have any questions, there's still a couple of minutes of time left. You can pose them and they'll be on the recording. But if not, feel free to go off and get a coffee before you go on to your next thing. Ellen has raised an excellent point there, which is that your client may be technical, but they may be a different technical. If they're a chemist, a biochemist, the boot may be on the other foot, as we would say in English. So your client may not have your technical knowledge, but they may have their own technical knowledge. And they may well be quite good at maths, but will they still want to hear all of the technicalities? And will the audience be mixed? I guess when you're presenting to clients, it's one of the issues is are they all biochemists, or have you got an HR person in with a biochemist? So dealing with mixed audiences, what do you do then? Do you ignore the non-technical people? Do you try to pitch a middle course, or do you focus on the non-technical? So we have a question. Is there a way that I can gauge the technical level of my audience before presenting? Getting to know your audience, exactly as Eleanor says, you get to know them in advance. You know, if you're dealing with an analytics project, you've got the whole length of the project. So in the very early stages of the project, when you're meeting your clients or different stakeholders for the first time, you would use that opportunity to get to know them, you know, get to know a little bit about their background. You could ask them, you know, there's no harm in asking them if you've got a good relationship. You can ask them. But you may, I think it's an interesting question, you may, you will be in situations where you don't necessarily know who's in the audience. And I guess then you have to take a punt, as we'd say. You know, you have to make an assumption. I'm going to assume that there will be some non-technical people in the audience, so I won't include the technical details. I might include that as an appendix for those that are interested, or, you know, that sort of thing. So you won't necessarily always have the luxury of knowing who's in the audience. But if you do, then it is good to get to know them ahead of time. If you're going to go and meet clients or different stakeholders, have coffee with them, have lunch with them. And if you're really unsure, ask. You know, if the client says, oh, I think this is an excellent project, I really want, can you come and do a presentation? There's going to be a load of people there. Go back to the client and say, can you give me a bit of a steer so that I know what type of presentation to put together? You know, you can always ask. Ask them, you know, whether it's going to be very technical people in the audience, or whether it would be better to make it a much more managerial type presentation. So I think we will stop the recording there. Oh, we've got one more question. Might not be for entry-level analysts, but I think when you are at a certain level, pre-lobbying before presentation is often useful. I'm not quite sure what you mean by pre-lobbying. Do you mean that, you know, you're going to drip feed some, you might be drip feeding some results before you go, or are you suggesting that you ask, when you get to a certain level, you'll have the confidence then to go and ask? And Ellen is saying, did you mean gaining stakeholder buy-in or support in advance of meetings? So yes, but I guess the same principle applies there, doesn't it? That you need to understand whether your stakeholder whether you consider them to be a technical person or a non-technical person. You still have the same principles there. So thank you very much for your participation and all your questions and the little extra questions you've had at the end. Do go off, get a coffee now, and we will see you in the workshops later this week.